electronic transmission install simple? This is what we're going to talk about today. So what we're here to cover is to get you guys the background and the knowledge that you need to understand the different types of transmissions that are available and how to pick the best transmission for your package and for your installation to make your project successful. Quick overview of who PCS is, or are. We're an engineering and production firm. Our specialization is automotive driveline. We do 100% of the design and development is done in-house along with the manufacturing. We manufacture 100% of our products in-house. There's no outsourcing during any step of our development. We do everything at our production facility. Our specialization is transmissions. So we know when it comes to transmissions, we know everything there is to know about them, hydraulically and electronically. We have 2 locations. We have our engineering and corporate headquarters located in Ashland, Virginia. If you're not familiar with that side of the country, we're just south of D.C. Our production facility is in Sharon, Pennsylvania, which is north of Pittsburgh, just outside of Youngstown, Ohio. Once again, all of our products are made here in the U.S. We have 3 sales offices. Obviously, we have a sales office at our location in Ashland. We also have one here in the Detroit area, and we also have one in Shanghai. The Shanghai office is solely for our OE level sales, but the Detroit office specializes in the aftermarket and performance racing, and our Ashland facility does everything. Okay, so what are the advantages of electronic transmissions? The biggest one, obviously, is the ability to calibrate the transmission for a wide variety of engines and vehicles. That means if you have different power levels, different weights, different axle ratios, tire sizes, things of those natures, you can, with the electronics, you can make your adjustments to calibrate the transmission directly to the requirements of the vehicle. Which means you don't have to get inside the transmission to adjust modulators or accumulators or anything like that, mess with spacer plates and orifices and things to get the shifting the way you need it for your particular vehicle. It allows you to take one transmission that can work in a very lightweight, high-power vehicle and also use it in a heavy, low-power vehicle. Also, electronic transmissions are almost always overdrive. So overdrive transmissions are obviously in everything that you drive today. Allow you to reduce your cruising RPM, increase your fuel economy, and just make it a generally a more pleasable vehicle to drive. The other advantages of electronic transmissions are diagnostics. So transmissions today and the control modules are able to detect problems in the transmission and take steps to protect the transmission from any further damage that may have happened. So what that means is if something goes out in the transmission while you're driving, generally you're going to get some kind of limp mode to get you home. It's also going to let you know something is wrong because all of a sudden either your check trans light comes on if you have one, or the trans is just stuck in one gear. So that gives you an indicator that there's something wrong. Also, electronic transmissions are what comes behind all of your new engines. So if you're using any of your newer engine options, electronic transmissions are pretty much your only option that you have, besides manuals, obviously. The other advantage of electronic transmissions is you can get the best of both worlds out of one. You can have a firm shifting, performance style shift at heavy throttle, and hey, I like to drive this thing around town and don't want to get my teeth knocked out at light throttle. Okay, all electronic transmissions are not created equal. What this means is that unlike engine control, which is very standardized from one manufacturer to another, electronic transmissions are not. So a Ford transmission does not use the same control system as a Chrysler transmission, which is not the same as a GM transmission. So what may appear on the surface like they are similar because you tell it what gear to go into and that's the gear it goes into, What happens in the hydraulics and the electronics is very manufacturer dependent. And so what that requires us to do is our control modules have to be flexible and universal so that they can be configured for whatever type of transmission that you want to do. So understanding these will give you a big advantage in choosing which transmission that you want to use, because some of the transmissions are hydraulically are simple, which means electronically they are complex, which means that they will take more effort and more work to calibrate. PCS internally, we divide this into two generations of transmissions. So our first generation transmissions and our second generation transmissions. First generation being the simpler designs, easier to work with. The second generations being the more complex ones. Your typical first generation transmissions would be something you'd find from your mid-90s through the early 2000s. Most of the complexity of the shifting is still handled hydraulically. So the electronics have a very limited amount of things that they can do, and it's still mostly a hydraulic transmission. So they're electronically simple. So you'll typically have on-off solenoids and a single pressure control. They're simple to tune. I'm sorry? Yeah, so some of the solenoids are pulse width modulated, some of them are on-off. Your typical pressure controls, anything that's doing a pressure control where it's a linear amount of pressure based on the current going through the solenoid, those are pulse width modulated. And your first generation transmissions will typically only have one, sometimes two of these style solenoids. The rest of the solenoids would be on-off solenoids or simple controls. These transmissions are relatively simple to tune, meaning that there's not a lot of parameters to adjust. They're easy to understand what's going on, and they're also more difficult to damage when you get some numbers wrong. We also recommend these for everybody. It doesn't really matter what your skill level is. Your skill level and your understanding is only going to dictate which controller you pick. It's not going to dictate whether you use an electronic transmission or not. What we're saying is that we can sell these transmissions to anybody, but depending on the type of control that you want to do with it, we would sell you a different module to go along with it. Some of the modules are simple, really easy to use, and some of them are more difficult. Well, what it is, we build several TCMs that will work with a 4L60E. And so, yeah, and we'll get to those later in the presentation. And what we're saying is that depending on what your skill level is in electronics, we're going to either sell you one that gives you a very limited amount of adjustments, or we're going to give you one that gives you full control. You can do anything and everything you want, or we're going to stick you in this little window and be like, okay, you can move your shift points, you can move your converter lockup, and you can move your shift firmness, but you're constrained within limitations so that you don't confuse yourself, and so you make the installation much simpler. So if you're not doing anything crazy, then we're going to put you in this simple module. Or if your skill level is relatively low, you're not handy with a laptop, or you're in a hurry, you don't want to spend weeks calibrating this thing. You want to spend 5 minutes calibrating it. We'll give you this module. But if you like the ability to go in and do whatever you want, we're going to sell you something different. And so we'll get to that later on about which module would be best for your skill level. Yep. And back to your analogy about the Turbo 400 versus the 4L60E, it's still a similar system. You've got your governor telling it when to shift. That's electronic. Basically you have an electronic governor and you have an electronic modulator now. And so because there are other conditions you can compensate for, and so you can make the transmission shifting better than the original mechanical systems were. It also gives you a wider range of adjustment. So you can have firmer shifts, softer shifts, all in the same package. This is a typical list of what we consider our first generation 4-speeds. Okay, so you have your 4L60, which is what we were talking about. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be a non-electronic. So, you know, in that scenario, you know, you don't necessarily need anything from us. So, you know, if the customer can set the transmission up correctly for his application, then they have a lockup converter control, which is you know is yeah. Yeah, when the 4L60E came out, which is only an electronic version of the 700R4. In fact, GM changed the nomenclature of the 700R4 towards the end of its life and actually called it a 4L60. Then they came out with the 4L60E, which was a fully electronic version of the 4L60. Yeah, now you can use a 4L60E, and there are several versions of the 4L65 and a 4L70. You can use those in place of where you used to use 700R4s. The difference is, like a 4L70, you know, a properly configured 4L70 is an extremely capable transmission. And so you really have a wide range of applications you can use that on. You know, that comes in a factory application of over 400 horsepower. So it really gives you some capability there right out of the box. So it's you can really cover a lot of applications that way. Yeah, because what you won't have to worry about so much is how is this 700R4 configured? Right. You know, now some of the guys, you know, some people you can't talk into electronics, and we understand that. That's not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is, if your customer wants electronic trans, you know, 4L60Es are extremely cheap to get a hold of, particularly if you don't care if it's new. You know, you're looking at a reman price of less than $1,000. 700R4s are getting up there in price. You know, they're harder to find, and you know, what you don't have to worry about is you can go get a 4L60, and generally you don't have to worry about whether it's capable for your application. The 200R4, the 200R4, the 204R. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a shorter, yeah, that's a better packaged gear train, so it's a smaller trans. So actually the 200R4 gear train wise is identical to a 4L80. If you've ever looked at them, it's the same gear train design as a 4L80, just smaller. So really it's a smaller version of the 4L80, only they never made an electronic version of it. So it's basically a 3-speed with an overdrive unit added on the front of it, whereas the 4L60 is a completely different type of gear train configuration. So they're not, the 4L60 and the 4L80 are not comparable in any way other than they're both made by GM. They're absolutely completely opposite each other in design. So continuing on, these are some of the other, what we consider first generation 4-speed. So we consider these easy to calibrate, and we would sell these to any skill level person. Okay? The only exception there is the Chrysler, the first generation, there aren't a lot of Chrysler options because Chrysler kind of stepped over that first generation style control and went straight into some relatively complicated controls. The one exception is the 47RE, but the 47RE is only partially electronic. On the 47RE, you can't actually tell it what gear to go into. All you can do is move the shift points up and down on it. So it has an electronic governor is what it has. It doesn't have a gear command system like the other transmissions. And then one thing to note is on the 4R100s, if you ever get into an application where you need a big Ford rear-wheel drive trans, we recommend sticking with the 4R100 over the E4OD simply because the E4OD does not have an output shaft speed sensor on it, which is a requirement for all of your modules. And so you would actually either have to refit that, or you would have to make sure you get the differential that goes with it that has the speed sensor on it, which if you're doing swaps and things like that, it's a real pain in the butt. Right. For most people, it's not a big deal. And the only thing it limits you is that because it's not a factory sensor, it puts you into, you have to use one of our higher level modules. Our simple off-the-shelf, our simple entry-level modules are 100% configured for what the 4R100 is. If you did that, yeah, if you put a 40100 sensor in it, then it would drop you back into, hey, I can use the 40100 control module, and it makes your installation a little easier. The same as all the others. So you have full converter lockup control, all your shift points, shift firmness, everything is adjustable on them. Yeah. The 40100 is equivalent to a 4L80, both in the design of the gear train and the electronic controls. The only difference is actually the E4OD 40100 family has one additional solenoid that is very useful, and that's the engine braking solenoid. So if you're electronically selecting a lower gear than what the selector is in, you still get engine braking with the E4OD 40100s, whereas the 4L80s, 4L60s, those you don't. Yeah. Yeah, so there's no real limitations to it. Just simply that output shaft sensor really is, for us, it's a tech support problem, because people will buy it and then there's no output shaft speed sensor and they have to figure out how to do it. So a lot of our customers, some of those things are difficult for them to do. Yeah, it's simply output shaft, and tail shaft housing. There are also some first generation 5 speeds. Okay, these are the GM 5L40, 5L50 family and the Ford 5R55E family, which is not to be confused with the 5R55 SW and N family, which fall under our second generation category. The 5R55E was really a small number of years that they used it. It was, I think, an A4LD was the original number of it, and they reconfigured the valve body and made a 5-speed out of it. So second generation transmissions. This is where it gets a little more complicated, and it also gets a little more difficult from the customer standpoint. These are any of the transmissions you're going to find from mid-2000s to present day. All of your clutch and band timing, everything is controlled electronically. What that means is when it shifts from one gear to the next, on some of the shifts, you have to release one element, reapply another element. In the first generation transmissions, that would have been controlled hydraulically, and all you would have just said was, hey, go to the next gear, the hydraulics take care of it, and it goes to the next gear. Now, in the second generation style transmissions, you have to control that timing electronically. So when you say, I want to go to second gear, you've got to time the release of one element and time the apply of another. If you miss the timing, you get tie-ups or you get flares. Flares are basically where the engine revs up in between the shift. A tie-up is where the vehicle feels like it noses over in between a shift. These transmissions fall under both internal and external controls, which means that some of them have actually the computer built into the valve body. Some of them have them external. And if you ever look at the hydraulics on these, the hydraulics are relatively simple. So because everything is done electronically, they just simply have solenoids that control your individual elements, and they don't worry about sequencing valves and things like that. So the hydraulics are relatively simple that way. There are some second generation 5 speeds, just like there's some first generation 5 speeds. What there aren't really are many second generation 4 speeds. Chrysler is the only one that has a trans that falls under that category. But there are some second generation 5 speeds. These are, they use external controls. There are no second generation 5 speeds that have internal controls or internal computers. Once again, there's more parameters to calibrate. They're also much easier to damage. Because as the tuner, you're required to make sure that the sequencing is correct. If you tie the trans up, that really does some damage to the clutches relatively quickly, and which means that the trans can be fragile for a beginner tuner. Now, once you figure out what's going on and you understand what's going on in the valve body, typically it's a very steep learning curve. So once you get a handle of what's going on, you can quickly make the adjustments and make the trans shift correctly. For these transmissions, we recommend that the customer has a hydraulic understanding of what's going on inside the trans, because it will help you in the tuning quite drastically. So if you understand what the solenoids are actually doing, then it makes your tuning much simpler. These are the second generation 5-speeds. Now, a lot of these, you'll see, this is where your typical Chrysler transmissions come in, both the 545 RFE and the NAG1, which is technically a Mercedes transmission, but Chrysler's been using it. We also got your Allison transmissions there. Those are, now there's also a 6-speed Allison, so you'll see it in both 5 and 6-speed categories. On these, yeah, so starting in 2000 and, I think 2001, 2003 maybe. Yeah, somewhere in there up to 2005 were 5 speeds. 2006 and up, they made it a 6-speed. And it's one of those, they're the same trans. All they did was did a valve body change to bring on another clutch, and they made it a 6-speed. Why they didn't make it a 6-speed in the beginning, I have no idea. So it's the same reason why didn't GM make the 4080 a 5 or 6-speed in the beginning? It can be done. Yeah. Right. Now, for these style transmissions, we recommend you go through our dealer network. And the reason being is that we have dealers that their specialty are these individual transmissions. And so they can give you base cals, they can give you tuning support, and they can give you everything that you need to do these transmissions. The 5R110, on this list here, the 5R110 is our most popular one. There's a lot of Cummins swaps in Ford vehicles that they keep that trans. Yeah, it's a good trans. There's nothing wrong with the trans. So when the engine goes out, they opt to keep the trans, swap the engine, and makes it the swap a little easier to keep in the factory trans. Yeah, a lot of 6 liters, even the 6.4s. Our second generation 6-speeds. You'll find these both in internal and external controls. Some of them have mechatronic units, some of them are external modules. The 6R80 is a particularly tricky one because Ford actually has it in both versions. There are 2 years of the 6R80 where the computer is built into the valve body, and then all of your recent years up to current, they're all external control. All that means for you as a user is it determines what type of interface you get from us. So if you have an external control transmission, then you would need our module that controls all the solenoids and gives you full control of the trans. If you've got one that has an internal controller, then you would need our module that works with the electronics that are already there. So we do them both ways. You have to know which one you have. Once again, these external controls are significant, not to be underestimated. It's a significant amount of calibration work. If you're an end user of these, you would expect to spend probably several months getting it exactly where you want it. And that's because you're going to drive it a couple hours here and there. You're not going to work on it every day. Now, if you're a shop, you're doing this for a customer, I would expect to spend no more than 5 or 6 days. And it's simply because all these things are very temperature sensitive, and you usually only get one shot at making a cold adjustment before it's heated up and come through that point. So you're going to get one shot in the morning to make an adjustment, and if you miss it, you got to wait till the next morning to get it again, or you got to cool the trans down. So if you're a typical installer shop, you don't have a cold chamber to put the vehicle in, you'll have to do these, so you're not going to spend 5 days solid on it, but you're going to spend probably an hour or 2 a day on it for 5 or 6 days to get it exactly right. It also, on these 6-speeds, almost all of them are clutch-to-clutch transmissions, which clutch-to-clutch refers to a style of transmission where the handoff for the gear change, you're releasing one clutch and you're applying another clutch. So there's a point there where load is carried through 2 different gear sets. So one gear set that's coming off and one gear set that's coming on, both are carrying load. And so there's a specific tuning technique used to calibrate those style transmissions. Yes. And that's because the reason, yeah, there is. In fact, they want to get completely away from bands, and they want to get away from brakes. So a brake is a clutch version of a band. So it just stops something from turning, right? Well, the problem is when that element is turning and that brake or band is not applied, there's fluid friction between the 2 elements. So you're still getting friction. So So in today's terms, where fuel economy, when it's released, right, when it's released, there's still still oil friction between the two parts. And so in today's world, where fuel economy numbers are getting harder and harder to increase, they are taking extreme steps of reducing things like clutch drag. And so today's transmissions, in terms of efficiency, are quite drastic compared to your older 4-speed transmissions. I mean, there's in excess of 10% efficiency gain in a new transmission over an old transmission, just in clutch and spin losses. For example, like a 4L80. So if you 4L80, you get from what, 89 all the way to, well, I think they carried it into the 2000s. Okay, that trans versus a 6L80, which started in 2005, somewhere around there. The fuel economy difference between those two transmissions is drastic. Right, simply because they took extreme steps to reduce the parasitic losses, also to reduce the amount of items that are spinning at any one time. So by reducing the amount of things that are spinning, they're reducing spin losses, which is inertia, which takes power to accelerate that stuff up to speed, and then also the clutch drag. And so now the clutch drag thing came about after your 6-speeds came about. So what you'll see are there are several generations of 6-speeds, and the later ones are more efficient than the early ones. Simply all they did was go in and reconfigure the clutches so that at any one point in time, they might only have one clutch that is open. The rest of the clutches are applied. And that way only that one clutch is providing frictional drag. All the other clutches are applied. So they reconfigured it. So instead of having 2 clutches on at one time, yeah, right. And that's what a brake is. A brake is a clutch version of a band. So a band, all it does is stop something from spinning, right? Well, they do the same thing with clutches, where they'll put a clutch where it's splined to the case, okay, and it's got something spinning, and when it clutch applies, it stops whatever it is from spinning. That's technically called a brake, not a clutch. Yeah. So they'll call those brakes. Yeah. So they've. Yeah. Yeah. And so they've eliminated those. There are no bands and brakes in any of your new transmissions. That's because those are the worst ones in terms of drag. Yeah. So. So one last thing on the 6-speeds is that we provide a base calibration for all of these transmissions. So what that means is that if you're working with a trans that we have never done before, then you'll have to work with us to get a base calibration set up. And what that means is we'll configure the module for whatever trans that you're working with, and we'll basically lay the shifting methods out for you so that all you have to do is tune it. You don't have to actually worry about the multi-levels of configuration that's required. Yes and no. It depends on the trans, but when we're setting up a base cal, typically it's non-vehicle dependent. It's just, we put the trans on our dyno, we go through and we get it shifting, and then, right. And that's what the purpose of calibrating in the car is, to make sure that you get it right for those weights and everything. On your GM side, the 6L80, 6L90 is a second generation 6-speed. It has the control unit built into it, which means that you have no direct control of the solenoids themselves. They're all controlled by this little brick you see right there. Now these transmissions with our new, with one of our new modules, they're relatively easy to work with now. So we've taken the complexity out of it, and we've made them much easier to work with, as long as you stay within the original, well within the original design limits. Meaning that if you're trying to put one of these behind a 600 horsepower carbureted engine, you're going to have trouble. But if you put it behind a 400 horsepower fuel-injected engine, that's what it came with from the factory. It's going to be relatively easy to make that trans work there. Okay, so on the 6L80, 6L90, as long as you stay within those stock power levels, you don't require any reprogramming of the mechatronic unit. So we're able to work with what's there. Our module will create the torque model along with whatever parameters are needed to make that trans operate correctly, and send that information to the transmission. So what we're doing is basically a piggyback system where Instead of us directly controlling the trans, we're manipulating the module that's already there to get the control that we want out of it. Torque management typically is not required on these transmissions until you get above the 300 horsepower range. The reality is you can actually go well above that without torque management. It's all about how long you want the trans to live. The trans absolutely will shift great at 500 horsepower with no torque management for some limited amount of time, at which point it just stops working. So now you move into your project. So these are the things that you need to consider when picking a trans for your project. Okay, so obviously the simple one, does it bolt up to my engine? So if it doesn't bolt to your engine, then you'll have to worry about adapter plates, or creating your own type of adapters, to bolt it up. The second one is, does it even fit in my application? If you've ever seen a 6L80, 6L90 trans, they're not much larger than what you would typically expect. It's the shape of them that is different. And so because that shape is different, they don't fit in traditional tunnels very well. And so that's one thing you have to consider if you want to use one of these newer transmissions is, will it even fit in my tunnel, or am I going to have to cut the tunnel out? Second thing is the transmission capable of even holding up in my application? So is it sized appropriately for the weight and power of the vehicle? Now this can be confusing for some people because you may not always need the big transmission. If you've got a small tire and you've got a small lightweight car, at some point it's not going to matter how big your transmission is. It's also not going to matter how much power you have. You can have 1,000 horsepower, you can have 500 horsepower. If it starts to spin at 300 horsepower, then it doesn't do you any good to go with a trans that'll hold 1,000 horsepower because you're not going to be able to break it. So there's some tricks you can do there. Where if you have a high-powered, lightweight, small tire vehicle, you can get away with a smaller trans. You don't need to go with the big trans in those applications. Mm-hmm. Which are, yeah. Yeah, but see those but see like that transaxle is extremely capable. You can put a lot of power in that thing without really much fear of doing any damage. So because it comes in a high horsepower, high, big tire, relatively heavy vehicle compared to some of your street rods, it's going to be capable. You're not really going to have to worry about it too much. So next is there a controller option available for the trans? What that means is, if I take this trans and I put it in my street rod, can I even control it? And so we have definitely run into this before where people just assume there's a module out there for the trans that they want to use, and they call us when it's too late. They've already fitted the trans in there, and we're like, well, we don't have anything for it. And so we try to help people out as much as we can. If you get into a situation like that, we'll do the best that we can to set something up for you, but we can't guarantee that we'll have everything that you need. And then there are things to consider of what else is needed to operate that trans. And we'll get into the connection requirements here shortly. So next is your budget. Obviously, newer transmissions are going to be more expensive. And so obviously if your budget doesn't call for a $4,000 transmission, you might want to opt for one of the cheaper options. And then you have to worry about your wiring and electronics. So the newer transmissions require more electronics, more wiring. They're more difficult to work with, so with that comes more wiring. And are you comfortable using a laptop or small handheld tuner? If you're a type of person who just doesn't like a laptop, then you don't have to worry. There are options out there where you never need a laptop. So it's just one thing to consider when you're picking your module and picking your transmission. So you might pick a transmission module combination that doesn't require a laptop but does everything that you need it to do, and it saves you later on down the road from having to worry about tuning and calibrating this thing with a laptop. And then also, what's the support level like for my trans? Meaning that if you're using the trans above its design capability, are there parts available for it? If it's a trans that's relatively difficult to calibrate, are there a lot of people using it that can help me with the tuning? We may have base calibrations to get you close to what you need. So once you've chosen your control module, these are the requirements that all of the control modules in the aftermarket need. Got to have power and ground. You got to have some type of throttle position. Vehicle speed typically comes from the transmission, but not on all applications. Some applications, the vehicle speed sensor is located elsewhere on the vehicle, particularly the E4OD and the NAG1. So the Chrysler NAG1 never had a speed sensor in the trans for output shaft speed or for vehicle speed. It always got it from the ABS module. So in those applications, something has to be fabricated or cobbled together to get vehicle speed to the control module. Brake light's not required, but typically recommended. And that's really for panic brake situations, so you get the converter unlocked as quick as possible. On some modules, it's used also for grade detection. So if you step on the brake and the vehicle continues to pick up speed, thinks you're on a downhill grade, and will do a downshift for you to try to slow the vehicle down. Same thing with engine RPM. It's not a requirement by any means. None of the shifting parameters are typically based on RPM except for your wide open throttle shifts. So that's the only thing that's RPM based in the shifting parameters. But what RPM is used for is diagnostics. And most of the diagnostics have an RPM requirement. So if you omit RPM, you really are limited on the diagnostics that you can get after that. And then last is CAN, which you may or may not be familiar with what CAN is. But basically, CAN is the communications network that's used in all vehicles now. And on most engine applications that have a CAN network, we can get the information that we need. So we can get throttle position, we can get brake light, we get engine RPM. We'll get all that information from the CAN, which means you don't have to hook those wires up. A good example of that is the GM crate motor applications. So on those applications, you're not hooking any of that stuff up. Everything is either pre-wired for you, or we already get it from the CAN network. Throttle position can actually be shared with other existing sensors. So if you already have a throttle position sensor, chances are we can just share that with whatever module is already using it. If you're using a carburetor, then there are kits. Look, we have kits, and there are aftermarket kits available to put a throttle position sensor onto a carburetor. If you're using a drive-by-wire system, then we generally recommend that you use pedal position, and that's because your desired shifting is based on the driver's demand, which is what the pedal is. The actual throttle blade is not an indication of what the driver wants. So in those applications, we recommend you use pedal position and not drive-by-wire. And like I said earlier, typically these parameters can be obtained over CAN. So if your ECU has CAN, we can get the parameters that we need from there. This is an example of a upshift and downshift set. So this is where the vehicle would upshift and where it would downshift based on throttle position and vehicle speed, which shows you the importance of throttle position and vehicle speed. So you can see we have to know how fast the vehicle is going, and we have to know what the driver is requesting the transmission to do, which is what throttle position indicates. Also, throttle position, typically on your typical application, throttle position drives the pressure control in the trans. So this is an example of a pressure control scheme for a 4L60. This is a 100 horsepower diesel engine connected to a 4L60. So this gives you an idea of what the pressures look like. So as you get familiar with these numbers, they'll make sense to you. You'll see that that's almost minimum pressure in the trans most of the time. The other things to consider are your mechanical interface to the vehicle. So your cooler lines and your cooler. Placement of the cooler, size of the cooler is important. Your neutral safety, how are you going to get that? What does it need to be wired into? A shift lever. Obviously the transmissions don't have shift levers on them. You'll have to create one or use an aftermarket shifter or fit in a factory shifter. The other option is you can use what's called our GSM, which is a push button shifter that would replace your normal mechanical shift lever. Wiring of your reverse lights. Obviously you have to remember to wire that stuff up. And then one of the more commonly forgotten ones is the speedometer drive. So if you're using an older vehicle that's got a mechanically driven speedometer and you want to keep the factory gauges, then when you stick an electronic transmission in it, you lose that capability. So there are options out there available for correcting that problem. And then you have to worry about whether you have a four-wheel drive application or not. And the only thing that drives, that drives anything on the control module in terms of four-wheel drive is simply where the vehicle speed sensor is located. Because if it's located on the output shaft of the transfer case, then you have to tell the control module when you're in four-wheel drive low so that it can correct its speed readings. Okay, so how do we choose a TCM for our application? Obviously, the first and foremost is it even compatible with my trans that I want to use? And so that'll dictate typically whether it's a first gen or second gen or a mechatronic style transmission will dictate which control module that you choose. Second is ease of use. Are you afraid of a laptop or do you prefer a laptop? Diagnostics is a very important one that's typically skipped over in the aftermarket. Is what diagnostics are actually available for the trans, and how capable are those diagnostics. And what may or may not be important to some people are what parameters can I even adjust. So some of the modules don't allow you to adjust everything. Some of them fix some parameters for you and limit you on others. What's the technical support like? So does the company that you're going to get the module from provide good technical support? Are there support forums? Is the module commonly used, meaning that there are many people you may run into can answer questions for you? And then lastly is cost. Obviously cost is typically a big driver also. And what you'll find is that costing on most of your entry-level TCMs is fairly competitive, and they're all priced about the same. Yes? There are. We actually have an iPhone, or sorry, we don't have an iPhone. We have an Android app. We're working on an iPhone app. We have an Android app now that allows you to do your transmission tuning. For our simple shift TCM, which I'll get into here shortly, that TCM actually has an Android app for it. So it does require you to buy a Bluetooth interface kit for it, but it's relatively cheap. So this is our original TCM 2000. This is the most capable transmission control module on the market. You may see it with different labels. We have sold this to many different companies with different names on it. So this is typically what it looks like. So this was designed for all transmissions. So when we approached this module, we said we're going to be able to cover all the transmissions that are on the market. That was 12 years ago. Since then, transmissions have changed quite drastically. Luckily for us, we over-designed it, and we have not had to change that hardware since then. You'll also find this in some of your OE level labs. So GM and Ford will use our module when they're developing new transmissions because their control guys typically lag in getting the control modules. They get the hardware done first, and they want to run the transmission. They'll use our modules to get the transmissions up and running. Like I said earlier, this is the most capable controller on the market. There's no one out there that can touch the capabilities of this module. These are what you see here is a list of transmissions that it's just a partial list of the transmissions that we have done with this module. And we have literally hundreds of different transmissions that we have done with this module. It is software-based only, meaning that there is no handheld tuning interface, there is no button or knob controls for it. 100% laptop done. So every time you want to adjust something on it, you got to pull the laptop out and do it. It's compatible with both our first and second generation style transmissions. Next we have our simple shift. This is our most common aftermarket module now. And that's simply because there's no laptop required. All of your adjustments are done with these knobs you see here on the back. All of your diagnostics are translated to you with the two lights that are on the back there. So with those two lights, you can determine what gear the transmission's in, whether the converter is locked up or unlocked, and you can also see whether there are any diagnostic codes, and you can see if you can judge how fast the light is flashing, you can tell how fast you're going. So like I said, no laptop required. All of your adjustments are done here. It does have the option of still using the software if you want. It comes pre-configured for whatever transmission you order it for. So if you order this for a 4L60, it's going to be 100% configured for 4L60. All you do is plug it in, hook your throttle position up. It auto-calibrates the throttle for you. So all you do is sweep the throttle one time, and it will learn the limits and remember those for you. So you don't have to get into the laptop and tell it what your wide open throttle values are. Yeah, yeah, and that's actually we've had complaints of people who have a disconnect, and every time they reconnect it, they complain it shifts erratically. And what's happening is as you keep driving it and you keep moving the throttle further and further, it keeps relearning that as your new 100% throttle range. So all the shift points get changed. They constantly change until you do it. So if you forget to sweep the throttle, yeah. So yeah, so we've had to do the same thing, yeah. And that, like I said, that is a normal complaint that we have had. So unfortunately, the design of it, there's just nothing we can really do to get around that. So the knobs allow you to adjust your shift firmness, your shift points, and your converter lockup. Now they're also adjusted in low and high ranges, meaning that low throttle, high throttle. So if your low throttle just needs to be adjusted, you would turn the low throttle knob. If your high throttle needs to be adjusted, you turn your high throttle knob. If you need something adjusted in the mid-range, you'll have to balance it between the two knobs. This is our easiest to support module, simply because it has the most diagnostics. So if there's anything goes wrong, this module is going to tell you. That means if you detect slip, if the converter is slipping, if a sensor drops out or a solenoid is disconnected, it's going to tell you anything and everything that you need to know. We sell them as complete kits, which comes with full wiring harness and everything that you need. If you need a throttle position sensor, it would come with that. So that your installation, when you buy a kit, the installation is going to have everything that you need. Like I spoke of earlier, it has a self-calibrating throttle. The diagnostic and status lights are built in, which gives you a good indicator that everything is working. Now, the simple shift is only for the first generation transmissions. We don't do a second generation style in the simple shift. If the knobs don't get you what you need, we still have our full tuning suite available for that module. So you can use the software if you're a software guy. We also have a handheld tuner. So if you don't want to use a laptop, but you want to do more adjustments than what the knobs give you, you can use the handheld tuner to adjust all of your settings. The handheld tuner is a full color device. It gives you almost the same capability as the software does. So you can adjust all your shift points at the individual points. You can adjust all your converter lockup, shift firmness. It also does data logging and allows you to view and clear your codes. It can also be left in the vehicle. So because it is a really good gauge system, although this is just set up as Speedo and a few little things there, you can reconfigure that monitor screen to show whatever you want. So it's some people opt to install them permanently in the vehicle. The TCM 2600 is what we use on all of the internal control module transmissions. So what this allows you to do is any trans that has the control module built into it, this is the module you're going to use to run that transmission outside of its normal environment. So what this module does is takes in your basic inputs, RPM, throttle position, brake light, and it creates all the communications and torque model structures to operate the trans. Yes. Mechatronic. Yeah, actually, I probably didn't know. Mechatronic is a term used to describe the new style transmissions that have the computer built into the valve body. So they're an electromechanical control system. So they're solenoids and a computer module all built into one device. And so the industry term for that is a mechatronic unit. Mm-hmm. You're about a 80% chance it's going to be a mechatronic. So there are some. So the Allisons are not. The Ford 6-speeds are not. But all the GMs, all of the BMWs, and anything built by ZF, all of those are mechatronics. Yeah. Built into the valve body, right. Yep. So the 2600 will give you all these other things that you need to install that trans in your vehicle. So it gives you your neutral safety, your backup lights, and can also do your torque management for you. To go along with all of our modules, we have paddle shifters, mechanical shifters, which is basically a replacement for, mechanical shifters, which is your actual shift lever. And then we have electronic shifters, which is a replacement for the mechanical shifter. Gear displays and a mechanical Speedo Drive. So these are accessories that some people sometimes forget about and skip over. So our paddle shifters, they're designed with the look and feel of an OE paddle shifter. If you've ever picked one of these up and pulled one of the paddles on it, you would be surprised at the feel of it. It's quite ergonomic. It's a snap action, so there's no mistake that you pull the paddle. Yeah, you'll see this. There's a few other people overseas that buy them also, right? Yeah, so, and we sell these as a plug-and-play option for our Simple Shift kits. So the Simple Shift harness is already wired for it. All you do is just plug it in. Thank you. And it does have a display on it that can display a lot more than just the gear. There's actually a button on the back that allows you to scroll through most of your typical parameters: throttle position, RPM, vehicle speed. Everything can be displayed on that little display there. We have them for 5, 6, and 9 volt applications, and like I said, the display once again shows you a lot more than just gear position. The GSM is our mechanical shifter replacement. So what this allows you to do is, even though all your transmissions today are still electronic, even though they're electronic, they still require mechanical actuation to tell it what gear to go into, which means that if you want to go in reverse, you got to put the selector in reverse. The electronics cannot tell it to go into reverse. There's still hydraulic overrides for that. So if you want a push button shifter, this is for you. So it's a slim, compact module. The module is only a 1/2 inch thick. It's designed to be surface or flush mounted. The buttons are recessed and they're a long throw action, so that if you accidentally put your hand on the shifter, you can't accidentally push a button. It also has built-in safety features, so you got to have a brake light input, you got to have vehicle speed, so it's not going to let you put it in reverse above a certain speed. It's also not going to let you take it out of park without your foot being on the brake. It does include upshift and downshift buttons on it for shifting the transmission manually. We also have a gear display, which is just a simple gauge that allows you to show what gear the trans is in. Now the way this thing works is when you're in normal automatic mode, it will show you what position the shifter's in, and when you put it in manual mode, it'll show you what gear the trans is currently commanding. We have these available in black and polished, and there's also 2 different sizes. We have a Speedo Drive. It allows you to drive your mechanical Speedo off of an electronic sensor. This would hook directly to our module, and you can calibrate it using the software on our module, or you can use this built-in calibration procedure. So this is great for people who just want to keep their stock gauges and don't want to worry about trying to swap these gauges over to electronic. We also offer a 6-speed valve body for the 4L80. If you're familiar with the 4L80 design, I'm sorry? Yep. Actually, it probably would. You could probably make it work as long as the RPM range is similar. So I think it goes up to 4,000 RPM is what it goes up to. So our 6-speed valve body is a conversion kit for the 4L80. If you're familiar with the gear train design in the 4L80, there is the ability to divide it up to make 6 speeds out of it. The advantage is that you get a 6-speed trans with the packaging and strength of the 4L80. No, this is a different one. TCI has one also. Ours is does a little more than theirs, and I'll explain exactly what the differences are. So ours, which is what you'll see different from the TCIs, is ours has electronic engine braking, so we can turn the engine braking on and off whenever we want. So if you have a car that you do autocrossing with, or if you're doing towing, it gives you, a downhill grade mode, and also gives you the ability to make it feel more like a manual trans if you're doing autocrossing or something like that. This is 100% new. It's not a remanufactured or used parts. These are 100% new parts. If you're keeping the stock gear set, it's really only good for a 5-speed, because when you divide up the stock gear set, you end up with two ratios that are very close to each other. But if you opt for the optional gear set, the 298, 157 gear set, you get a really nice 6-speed spread, which I'll show you here in just a second. Our kits come complete with everything you need: internal harness, gaskets, plates, solenoids, installation instructions. I don't have a price on the gear set, because that's still an ongoing. There are several gear sets out there right now you can buy. The problem is they're typically around $1,000, which kind of makes the cost of the trans get up there relatively quick. So we're working now getting our own gear set made off of production tooling. So we're trying to get that gear set cost down closer to a production gear set cost, which would be, $400 or $500. Yeah, so we're trying to get that down. So the valve body itself is less than $500 for the valve body. Now the 6-speed is only for our 2000. We don't have a simple shift version for the 6-speed. This is a comparison of what the 4-speed and 5-speed would look like. The bottom graphs are your acceleration, and the top graphs are the RPM band. This is for a 6.5 liter turbo diesel engine. So you can see how narrow the RPM band is kept. You can also see your gain in acceleration simply by changing the trans around. We do offer training workshops. Twice a year, we do training workshops at our facility in Ashland, Virginia. We cover both chassis dyno tuning and transmission dyno tuning. We also cover all different types of transmissions and how they are calibrated. They're mainly for our dealers, but we encourage anyone who wants to use the modules to come. It is by no means restricted to our dealers. We also cover a lot of these tough applications that we spoke about earlier. So many of these newer style transmissions that are difficult to calibrate, we explain the control system for all of these and the methods that you use for calibrating them at our training workshops. Workshops are 2 days. Yep. And because the technical level has gotten up there, they might be pushing it to 3 days now, because the last one we really struggled to get. With the number of people that we have come, it's tough to get everything done in 2 days. No, it's both of those are covered. And what we do is on the second day, half of the day we work on the transmission dyno to demonstrate certain control schemes, and then the other half of the day we show how to use a chassis dyno to calibrate the trans. So you're not out there on the street driving with your head in a laptop, which is obviously I'm sorry? I don't know. Good question. Sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. But I can find out real quick for you. Yeah. Yeah. When they come, it's on our website, and the cost is on our website for that. So, yep. So if you have any questions,